just working mostly on bicycle mobility and active mobility and micro-mobility. Yeah, so Alex, you might be just adding on to some of the things you would be saying. And just as a final statement from my side, we'll be talking quite a lot about e-vehicles during this webinar, but just wanting to say that our vision is that the most sustainable mode of zero emissions mobility is walking and active mobility. So this is just one option of the whole mix of mobility means that we need for zero emissions mobility in Europe. I also see Danielle Popov, who joined us. Danielle is from the transportation team in Zazamiato. Yeah, he's also a special invitee for this webinar. And he might also be joining with some comments and questions, adding on to what Alex will be sharing with us. Alex, welcome, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a brief introduction maybe before I start, and I'll share some slides shortly. So yeah, my name's Alex Keynes. I am Clean Vehicles Manager at Transport and Environment. So just to introduce Transport and Environment very briefly, we are Europe's largest clean transport NGO. We have our main offices in Brussels, and we have national offices increasingly now in some of the key capitals in Europe, in France, Germany, Spain, UK, Poland as well. And we're looking to grow further as well as our conversations with national member states also becomes more important. Our vision is for a zero emission mobility system that has minimal effects on health, environment and climate. We work across all transport modes, or most transport modes, I should say. Let's say our theory of change is that we, let's say our tactics is to enact regulatory change at primarily EU level and also national level to ensure that technology change is kind of forced upon industry. So when we're talking about cars, our vision for a zero emission road transport system is therefore a transition as soon as possible, and no later than 2035 to 100% zero emission cars. I will, having listened to what you said earlier though, Dragomira, about the most sustainable being, of course, walking and cycling. We, of course, certainly agree with that. And of course, everything that I say today has to go hand in hand with the modal shift away from, moving away from cars as much as possible. But our focus as an organization is how we enact technology change on the cars we still have. And of course, there's going to be millions and millions and millions of cars sold over the next decades. And it's essential that as many of those are zero emission as possible. I will now share my screen. Okay. I hope you can see my slides. Thank you. Okay. So firstly, building on what I said just briefly earlier, 2035, at least when we're talking about cars. So I should say that today I'll be only talking about cars and also vans as well. 2035 is the latest acceptable date after which all new car and van sales should be zero emission, fully zero emission. The reason for that is that Europe, as you know, and of course European member states have signed up to this, has committed to go climate neutral by 2050. A precondition of Europe meeting this 2050 carbon neutrality goal is that all cars and vans on the road by that point would have to be zero emission. Now, given the average lifespan of a car in Europe is around 12 years EU average, it's a bit more than that now, I think, actually. The latest date really has to be 2035, but given this average lifetime. Obviously, as you can see here, the average lifespan of a car is a bit lower in some member states and much higher in others. So Romania, Lithuania, 17 years. I understand as well that for Bulgaria, some of the data was lacking in recent years, but I think it's even higher than 17. As you can see, though, even if you have 2035 as the last date for selling zero emission cars and also trucks, there is still going to be some greenhouse gas emissions from the fleet on the road. So more action will still be needed to actually get these cars off the road by that point. So also kind of just to give a bit of context as to why, you know, going zero emissions is so important. Road transport, as I'm sure you all know, is a principal source of air pollution as well. So not only greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, but also air pollution. So as you can see here, I've highlighted road transport in red, highlighted the road transport contribution to these specific pollutants. And road transport is one of the primary sources of black carbon and particulate matter, but primarily it is the biggest source of NO2 emissions, or NOx emissions, which are particularly harmful for human health. So also, what is important to say is that even though road transport is responsible for 39% of all NOx emissions, it is actually responsible for 64% of all exceedances of NOx emissions in urban areas. So that's to say that in urban areas like Sofia, which suffer from particularly bad air pollution, road transport is almost double responsible for the emissions, the exceedances above EU limits that are experienced in many of these cities. Importantly, though, when we're talking about what type of cars this pollution comes from, of course, this is coming from ICE vehicles, so diesel and petrol. Battery electric cars, on the other hand, so fully battery electric, not plug-in hybrids or hybrids. Fully battery electric cars, of course, have zero engine out pollution, so no tailpipe emissions. Though it is important to say that particle pollution from tires is an issue for all types of cars and does need also addressing. So, as I've said, electric cars, fully electric cars are zero emission at the tailpipe, but they are also by far the best option for the environment when taking into account the full life cycle CO2 emissions. So, of course, it is important to look beyond just the exhaust pollution, just the tailpipe. We have shown, Transport and Environment have shown, we've updated our recent life cycle analysis this year, which you can see on the left. We have shown that today, an average EU electric car is already more than three times cleaner than an average petrol car. And you can see the differences according to the different assumptions that you make in the life cycle calculation. So of course, if you take the battery production and of course the charging of the electric car in the lowest carbon intensive grid, so for example that would be Sweden, then this benefit of electric cars is significantly improved. What is most important, however, is that on average this is a ratio that's going to improve every single day, at least let's say maybe not every single day given the energy crisis we have right now, but this is an improvement that we'll see improvement on average at least every year as the European grid continues to decarbonize, and of course renewable energy targets continue to be ever increasing. And of course, this is not something that you can, decarbonizing petrol and diesel is obviously not something you can do. So what about materials? We've talked about emissions. What about actual materials that go into electric cars and also petrol cars? So this is obviously one of the kind of big criticisms or counter arguments that's often made against electric cars. However, at T&E, we think that some of this is kind of a bit misplaced. It's important, of course, to consider the amount of materials going into battery electric cars, but this has to be considered in relation to the existing thing that batteries are replacing, which is, of course, oil. So an EV battery requires significantly less resources in terms of battery metals than a petrol or diesel car does in terms of fuel over the lifetime. The crucial difference between fuels used in conventional cars and of course the metals used in batteries is that battery metals can be recycled and reused infinitely. Of course, the same cannot be said of oil. So when we did a simple, well, not simple, we did a calculation of actually how much impact these different vehicles have on material use. When you take into account the recycling of the battery cells, so the copper, the graphite, the nickel, the cobalt, and the lithium, based on actually recently proposed recycling targets by the Commission in the new battery regulation, we calculate that around around 30 kilograms of metals would be lost lost in the recycling process or consumed by a battery electric car. You can see the size, this kind of a small block or the size of a football in the bottom left. For oil, though, to compare, recycling is of course not an option, and the lifetime consumption of petrol, which is slightly worse than diesel given the efficiency, is around 300 to 400 times more, and the equivalent of a tower of oil barrels 90 meters high. So you can see the amount of actual resource consumption of a petrol car in comparison. Another benefit of electric cars and the transition away from the ICE and oil-based system is actually jobs. This is, of course, another contentious point is of course, the existing industry focused on internal combustion engines, the car industry and the supplies industry is, of course, concerned about job losses in this transition. And of course, we have to be realistic and honest. There will be job losses in this transition. However, a recent study done by Boston Consulting Group shows that actually on average, so if you actually look at the net impact of the new jobs and the jobs lost, given there will actually be more than 580,000 new jobs in the new European electric vehicle ecosystem, the net impact is basically zero. So the study concludes that all the jobs lost will be replaced by new jobs. Of course, this is not a simple, this is not to say that everyone will, who loses a job in ICE manufacturing will get a new job in battery manufacturing. And of course, reskilling workers is a key challenge that faces European and national policymakers in this transition. But it does show there will be jobs available, enough of them as well. A comment maybe to make here is that Bulgaria, we think, is particularly well placed to benefit from the new electric vehicle value chain. In some of the new jobs, types of jobs that will be coming. For example, in terms of obviously charging, installation of charging points and new renewable energy production, and civil civil works and construction, and of course battery manufacturing. One of the main strengths, or let's say relative benefits that Bulgaria has, is that it has very, very few legacy investments in ICE, internal combustion engine manufacturing, compared to other countries or regions in Europe. So now moving on to policy. So EU policies that are actually currently being revised right now. I'll just give a short overview of the most important one, which I'll focus on now. So the EU car CO2 law, or otherwise known as the EU car CO2 standards. So maybe a brief just explanation of what the car CO2 standards does. So it sets CO2 targets in terms of grams per kilometer on individual car makers per fleet. So basically, car makers have to meet a fleet-wide limit on the CO2 emitted from all of the cars they sell in the EU. And this is to say that, of course, it's not a limit on each car. Some cars can be much more polluting, some cars can be zero emission. And it's the balance of those cars, of the amount of the different cars, which leads to car makers complying or not complying. Of course, one of the easiest or main compliance routes the car makers have to meet their CO2 targets is by selling more and more electric vehicles, which is one of the main reasons the car CO2 standards is the main supply side mechanism or supply side tool for increasing the supply of electric vehicles in Europe. As you can see, in this very basic graphic that we've done, that as CO2 emissions go down, electric vehicle sales have gone up. This is very simple and obvious in many respects, but it shows that actually the importance of the regulation in increasing the supply of zero emission vehicles in Europe. So just maybe also to show what the regulation does and doesn't do. So as I said, it sets an average CO2 limit in terms of grams of CO2 per kilometer for any car maker selling on the EU market. It gives additional credits for selling zero and low emission cars, such as battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell. And crucially, it fines car makers who fail to achieve their CO2 targets. There's a huge incentive for car makers not to fail. It also adjusts targets to the weight of the vehicles as well. What it doesn't do and cannot do, unfortunately, is it doesn't influence the amount of cars. So the CO2 target is applying to the, it is relative to the amount of cars that are sold. It doesn't matter if the car makers sell more or less. It doesn't mandate the selling or production of amount of battery electric cars, but the higher the CO2 targets, the more battery electric cars car makers should have to sell. And it doesn't influence the size of the cars placed on the market. And also crucially, and this is one of the most important points for people in Bulgaria and also other Eastern European countries, is that it doesn't dictate where car makers are selling their low emission cars. And at the moment, obviously, one of the issues that the countries in Eastern Europe are finding is that most of the growth in electric vehicle sales is happening in Northern and Western countries. And this is something I'll touch upon again later. So currently the regulation is being revised by EU policymakers and is actually in the last legs before being concluded in what are known as trilogue negotiations. So briefly, what the European Commission proposed a year and a half ago was firstly an important zero emission target, so 100% zero CO2 target for all new cars and vans sold from 2035 in Europe, so this famous ICE phase out. Also an increased target in 2030, so that car makers have to reduce their CO2 by 55% for all new cars sold by 2030. Unfortunately, in our view, they did not increase the 2025 target, meaning the car makers won't have to sell many more electric vehicles until the late 2020s, which is unfortunate. So briefly, I wanted to touch on our priorities as transport environment, many of which are now a bit, at least it's a bit outdated because the policy process has moved on, but I wanted to explain a bit what our position was and why. So in terms of the long-term trajectory, as I said, our position and our view was that Europe has to go 100% zero emission or battery electric vehicle sales by 2035. This graph here, and I'll explain what this does, what this shows now, is demonstrating a study that Bloomberg New Energy Finance did for us, where they modeled the feasibility from a techno-economic perspective of Europe going 100% zero emission vehicles across the whole of Europe. So importantly across different groupings of member states. As you can see, they're grouped into the northern, western, southern, and eastern. So the results basically show that with the right policy support, including CO2 targets, but also national tax and incentive measures, conventional cars, ICE cars, can be phased out across all of Europe by 2035. So the important thing, though, that Bloomberg highlighted was the importance of early action and supply side targets coming in much earlier in the 2020s, which will help electric vehicle sales go up and, of course, costs come down because of economies of scale. This is crucial for Europe to be on a cost-effective and efficient trajectory to get to zero emissions by 2035. It's important to say you can't go from 0 to 100 overnight. You need to do this over a period of time to make sure there's no supply chain bottlenecks and that, for example, charging infrastructure can keep pace. Now, just touching on Eastern Europe. So, of course, Eastern Europe is starting from the lowest base of electric vehicle uptake, around 1.4% in 2020. So, of course, they grow the fastest during the 2020s, according to this analysis. So cost competitiveness coming around the mid-2020s between ICE vehicles and electric vehicles. I'll show a slide on that in a minute. But it takes a bit longer until 2030 until Eastern Europe hits around 44% average BEV adoption. The consumer buying patterns in these countries takes the longest to change as the second-hand market, it remains larger than elsewhere in Europe. Which of course limits the battery electric vehicle growth beyond the purchase price parity year. However, as EVs become more ubiquitous in the rest of Europe, then of course there's a delayed but very rapid increase in Eastern European countries. And additionally, brands such as Skoda or Dacia are more likely then to supply models that meet the preferences of this region a bit later on in the decade. So then coming to our short-term priorities, which links to the longer one, of course, is scaling up in the 2020s. So how do we get car makers to increase their production in the 2020s, which will make electric vehicles affordable sooner? So as part of the same analysis that Bloomberg did, they predicted that electric vehicles will be cheaper than fossil fuel vehicles between 2025 and 2027. And this is the same, this is before incentives or taxes is considered. So the main reason for this is the main cost drivers are basically the battery cost decreases and the electric vehicle dedicated production lines. So I'll maybe just show you the next slide first, just to say that although raw material prices increases that have been seen over the last year actually led to a small increase in battery prices this year. So as you can see, despite falling battery prices, significantly falling battery prices from 2013, in 2022, there was a very, very small increase in the price, which actually stopped the overall trend of decreasing every year. However, Bloomberg predict that next year prices will again start to decrease. However, the impact of this, unfortunately, is that the price parity point is slightly delayed in Bloomberg's original projections. However, what is most important, though, is to say that these cost reductions will only come if car makers scale up production in the 2020s. And this is the easiest way to get car makers to do this is to force them via the car CO2 regulation. Another benefit, let's say, of selling electric vehicles earlier is that in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, this reduces oil demand from Russia. This is not necessarily linked to the regulation, but of course it is a benefit of faster electrification of transport and of course higher CO2 targets. So the graph here shows over the years, the worrying correlation between Russian money spent on their own defense and the amount of imports of crude oil from the EU 27 plus the UK. So essentially, European imports of Russian oil have been directly, or well, let's say indirectly, financing Russian military aggression. As you can see here as well, 25% of Europe's oil imports come from Russia, and cars are the biggest consumer of the oil that we import in general. So of course, electrification is an additional benefit that Europe can more rapidly divest our addiction to oil, whether that comes from Russia or other regions in the world. Phasing out Russian oil should not mean that we create new dependencies on other authoritarian human rights abusing states, for example, in Saudi Arabia or Iran. Electrification of transport really should be about divesting from oil entirely. So then, what do we propose as transport and environment during this revision of the regulation? So we proposed CO2 targets that were in line with this Bloomberg cost-effective scenario to get to 2035. So we were calling for much higher CO2 targets than those proposed by the European Commission. 30% reduction in 2025, 45% in 2027, and then 100% in 2035. And also 80% in 2030. These targets would have given us a much more cost-effective pathway to zero emission, rather than the one in the dark grey, which means car makers can actually sell fewer electric cars than they would have to, given the actual market-driven projections that we see from industry. So what has actually been agreed by policymakers, because we're almost at the end of the legislative process. So this is what the European Commission proposed, as I showed earlier. And I'll show you what the European Parliament actually voted for. So European Parliament voted to confirm the 100% zero CO2 cut in 2035, meaning only zero emission vehicle sales. They also confirmed the same 2030 targets for cars and vans, and did not touch either the 2025. So this was disappointing, as we did not manage to convince MEPs, members of the European Parliament, to increase the ambition of the CO2 targets. EU governments in the Council too backed the 2035 target, but left open a potential loophole for the use of e-fuels or electro-fuels in ICE cars after 2035. They also did not touch the 2030 or 2025 targets. So unfortunately, the supply of electric vehicles until the late 2020s is likely to remain quite restricted in Europe, unless car makers go beyond what the regulation requires them to. which historically they have not done. Car makers have historically done exactly what the regulation requires them to. So again, what does this mean for Europe, and what does this mean maybe for Bulgaria? The final agreement is still to come in late 2022. So trilogues are ongoing now between the institutions to agree on a final text. But on the long term, this is very good. It means that by at least 2030, and of course, then until 2035, there's going to be a significant and very rapid increase in the amount of supply of zero emission vehicles in Europe. Unfortunately, though, this probably does come a bit late, as the supply of more affordable electric vehicles is only going to come in the late 2020s. So therefore, additional policies will be needed at EU and national level to spur supply of electric vehicles in the 2020s. So now maybe a word on Bulgaria, and looking at battery electric vehicle sales most recently in 2021. So on the left, this was the share of plug-in, so all electric vehicles, whether that's plug-in hybrids or fully battery electric, in the different member states. So EU-wide, there was total share of around 19%, sorry, in EU 27, that's not including UK and Norway, there was a share of around 18% of electric vehicles sold across the whole bloc. Though, of course, in Bulgaria, actually, last year came out bottom of the list in terms of electric vehicle sales. I think it was around 1 point, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, apologies, but I have it in another slide. Oh yeah, you can see it in the next slide actually. Then, but better news is this year, in 2020, in the first half of 2022, we have seen a still low but quite growing uptick in battery electric vehicle sales now in Bulgaria. So even though, of course, sales as an overall proportion of new vehicle sales remain very low, the trend is upward and in the right direction. Then in terms of policies that can really help at EU level and also at national level, for example, promoting a second-hand EV market is really important for countries like Bulgaria. I mean, all countries really, because it helps democratize the access to these vehicles, which of course most vehicles at first hand are prohibitively expensive for a lot of drivers across the whole of the EU. So making sure that we can get vehicles into the second and third hand used car market at much lower prices as quickly as possible is one of the main priorities that we should have. Unfortunately, because the targets remain low, this rate of cars getting from the first hand to second hand market will of course be slower until the late 2020s. Thankfully, though, as part of its Repower EU communication, so following of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis ongoing, the European Commission has said it would consider a legislative initiative to increase the share of zero-emission vehicles in company car fleets above a certain size. So the important thing here is that this is separate to the car CO2 standards, which looks at individual vehicle purchases. Of course, corporate vehicle fleets also can buy on the same markets, but the point being that company cars are much more able, to absorb the cost of first-hand vehicles, and the benefit being that cars in the corporate vehicle fleet usually stay on average around 4 years compared to 9 years in the individual fleet. What it means is that if we electrify cars in corporate company car fleets, and also that could mean actual companies with above a certain size. I also think groups like Uber and other large logistics companies. These will go very quickly into the second-hand market, where private drivers can purchase them for much cheaper prices. So just some stats here. Fleets account for around 20% of total light-duty vehicles, but are responsible for over half of all emissions. The point being that they drive a lot more as well. And as I said, they shape demand. They drive demand through new registrations of company cars, and then help shape the wider EU car stock as they reach the second-hand market. So this is one way that we can actually help stimulate the supply of cheaper second-hand battery electric vehicles. And T&E is calling for a target to say that all all company car fleets above a certain limit have to be 100% zero emission by 2030. And this would play an important role in increasing the supply of these vehicles in the second hand. Then at a national level, one of the most important policy tools that governments have is, of course, tax and incentives. And this is an incentive or a policy lever that the Bulgarian government is certainly not using to the best potential at the moment. I'll explain just a little bit here. So while most countries in Europe have oriented their systems of car taxation towards incentivizing low and zero emission vehicles, either by making electric vehicles cheaper for incentives or tax reductions, or making polluting vehicles much more expensive also through tax increases, Bulgaria is in fact one of the only systems in Europe which does not incentivize low or zero emission vehicles across all car taxes. Failing to provide fiscal incentives for these vehicles has produced the expected result, as we saw in the previous slides, with only, it was a 1.3% battery electric vehicle and 0.4% plug-in hybrid sales in 2021. These are numbers which, of course, are now improving, though. But this is the second lowest BEV share across the whole of the European Union, second only to Cyprus. So this graph is quite interesting, as it shows the net tax differential between equivalent battery electric and equivalent petrol vehicles. So this is taking a small segment B car and looking at how different countries across the EU tax this, whether it's the tax incentives and tax disincentives. So a high net tax differential, which is obviously when you take the tax incentives minus the tax disincentives, this is achieved by levying a high tax burden on polluting cars and a low tax burden on zero emission cars. As can be seen from this graph, Bulgaria ranks at the bottom of all countries in the EU in terms of incentives in this way. So in other words, the tax burden of an electric vehicle or a combustion vehicle in Bulgaria is very, very similar. However, looking at what is potentially achievable, Romania, which is of course a similar economic profile to Bulgaria, has put in place a very progressive system from a climate point of view, and is actually leading to impressive EV growth in the country. And as you can see, Romania ranks third in the EU, according to the tax differential between BEV incentives and ICE disincentives. So this can be done through increasing the tax burden, obviously on polluting vehicles, as I said, and decreasing it on ZEVs. So as I said, in the case of Bulgaria, it is really necessary to increase the tax burden through, for example, ownership taxation on ICE cars, or at least polluting ICE cars, and incentivize the purchase of electric vehicles through some purchase subsidies. So with that, I will leave my presentation there, and very happy to hear comments from the other panelists or answer any questions that there might be.
Thanks a lot, Alex. You intended to also talk about air quality and the relation between the climate policies and air quality, because you're also at TNE. This is one of the major things you do besides the climate neutrality focus, the clean air focus. And I know that you'll be working on the revision of the air quality directive, which is ongoing. So if you want to add just a few words on this, or we can also talk about it later.
Yeah, so I mean, apologies, I didn't include any slides on this, but as you're completely right. We as TNE will are already working on the revision of the air quality directive, which is it's due to be published, the legislative proposal to be published on the 26th of October, so very soon. And this will, well, we don't know what it would include, but our asks are for the European Union to, or the Commission, the first step, to propose alignment, so new EU air quality standards that are aligned with the WHO, World Health Organization recommendations, which were updated last year. So now the current EU limits, for example, for NO2 and also particulate matter, are now 4 to 5 times higher than what is recommended by the WHO. So update of these limits is sorely needed, and particularly in cities, of course, where populations in cities are exposed to much higher levels of air pollution than is safe for public health. I mentioned earlier that Sofia is one of those. Of course, most capital cities in Europe suffer from very bad pollution. And, you know, having in place much stricter limits is crucial to make sure governments in all of these countries take action to ensure that, you know, in particular, these cities are benefiting or are allowed to breathe clean air. I mean, it should be a human right. And of course, one of the benefits that we can get is if cities have to consider things like low emission zones, then of course this can really help clean up. So there was a study I was reading earlier that said, I think the implementation of a low emission zone in Sofia can decrease NO2 emissions by 92% by 2032. So, you know, of course, this is incumbent on the supply of low emission vehicles, though. So you can't. It is important that, of course, people are not restricted of their mobility needs. So, of course, low emission zones has to come hand in hand with investment in public transport. And also, of course, hopefully the supply of more zero emission vehicles.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Yeah, I would open first for comments from the panel, if there are any. I also have some questions myself and comments. Yeah, I see that people cannot ask questions in the chat because the chat is only available to the panelists, unfortunately. So I would suggest if the attendees can raise hands, they can afterwards be upgraded to a panelist, or another suggestion may be that all the attendees, which are not so many people at the moment in Zoom, are upgraded to attendees, to panelists, so that they can post their questions and comments in the chat window. Even if you can coordinate this with the tech team, that will be great. I think there are 6 people now who are attending, and they might be willing to share their thoughts, comments, ask questions. So I'll be happy to give them the opportunity. And Danielle is willing to contribute or clarify. So Danielle, please.
Yes, thank you, Draga, and Alex, to you for the presentation. I just want to put some issues that regards Bulgaria on the table, and eventually some questions. First, I want to comment on the petrol taxation. It's a very important issue because it's in Bulgaria at least, is very political dependent of the dependency of part of Bulgarian politics towards Russia. So it's really a big issue, and I believe that to the big extent, the solution of this depends also from the political pressure from EU, and particularly the European Commission. I can mention also the toll taxation, which was supposed to implement the polluter pay principle, and the introduction of the toll system was a precondition in 2012 to disburse the funding of 2014-2020, and still we don't have this system working. It was just recently introduced, but partially again. So we are really facing a big challenge here to the way to decarbonization. Also, something else which is important for Bulgaria, it was subject of proposals to the, for example, recovery facility, because to the big extent after the funding of the EU funds for the last 10 years, the situation in the city has improved significantly in the sense of the changes of the old public vehicles with low and even recently some zero emission ones. So let's say that the Bulgarian authorities are convinced that it's working in the cities, and the European Commission is pretty willing to finance such a project on different scale, even in a very big scale. So now for me, the big issue is how to get out of the cities and ensure the substitution of the old vehicles of the public transport in the intercity travels, or these very local travels that we have plenty of. That connects the small villages near big agglomeration. Usually there's a small buses, very old one, and my proposal was to choose one or several pilot municipalities, or even in a county level, when we can in one effort to substitute all the vehicles, taking out the vehicles that we know how much emissions they are causing, and substitute them with new zero emission ones. Because one of the big issue of the transport in Bulgaria is that, let's say that we are doing number of things, but they are not really super targeted. So it's very difficult to prove in front of the European Commission that the efforts are systematic. And if we switch to such a territory-based approach to substitute the vehicle systematically, it will be beneficial from accounting point of view. And I have also a question on the batteries, which we know that are a significant part of the electric vehicle prices. And during the last, let's say, 6 to 8 years, I have been asking to many people at the European Commission, from the lowest to the highest level, why we are still selling the batteries and not renting it. Like the car company can easily, instead of selling a battery, which of course the consumer do not need to own, and just rent it, this will reduce significantly the cost of the vehicle, but also the producer will benefit significantly, because we see the scarcity and the problems with the supply chain, and this will give certain level of security of the input of all materials for recycling that they can seriously count on. And I'm really surprised that this is so vaguely discussed, and for all these years I didn't had any meaningful answer from all level of European Commission civil servants. Can you give us some inside view, if you had as transport and environment such discussions with the Commission? Because I think that this can be a game changer, and yeah, it can be both beneficial for the industry also. Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. To be honest, I'm probably going to disappoint you with not really having an answer on this, because I think it's certainly, as you say, it's well, Chinese car makers are much more invested in this. So I know that CATL and off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly who is engaging in battery swapping, but I know battery swapping as a concept and as a business model is much more common in China. And I think some Chinese car makers were considering deploying some of this in Norway. I think it's more common in Norway, in fact. But it's a very good question as to why it's not more common in the EU. I don't know, to be honest, and it's something to look into, and I'm very happy to look into this and to take this into our discussions also with policymakers in the European Commission as well. It's not something that we've discussed at length with the European Commission. I don't know to what extent European policy can influence that so much. Of course, when you're talking about the car CO2 standards, such a regulation has no impact on whether the battery is leased or whether the battery is sold as part of the car. However, I think it's important to look into ways where we should be looking at leasing as a model, economic model more generally anyway. whether it's leasing cars as well as the batteries rather than fully ownership. But I think it's a very good question, and unfortunately, I don't have an insight answer. But I think it's something that we should be looking into more, and I'm very aware we will certainly look into this as well with our discussions with policy makers.
Alex, I just have a follow-up question, which is also related to the batteries. In the past 1 year, there has been a lot of communication back from owners who needed, for some or another reason, to replace the batteries of their vehicles. And there was like a general kind of attitude and understanding created in public space that it's extremely difficult to change a battery of an electric vehicle due to the lack of such batteries and due to the fact that they're very expensive and unavailable from the producer. This was especially relevant for Tesla car users and owners. And do you have any comment on this? Why? I mean, is this a real conflict, or was this some kind of anti-advertisement campaign by opponents or rival companies, or is this a real problem that will affect the sale of electric vehicles in the coming months and years?
This is not something that will. This is not a structural problem of electric vehicles or batteries. I mean, batteries are improving all the time. So, you know, I think most people actually wrongly assume that the average lifetime of a battery or battery warranties is around 8 years. In fact, most batteries will outlast cars that they're used in. Batteries these days will have an average lifetime of around 14 years. So, you know, that certainly is not and will not be a structural problem with battery performance or durability. No, I can't comment on any individual car makers' kind of safety or issues that they might have with any of the software or something like this. I'm afraid, but no, everything we understand now is that batteries are improving increasingly in terms of their lifetime and durability. So no, not at all.
So for the second-hand market, in a way, the producers should be focused on the production of batteries, I guess. So if we in Bulgaria will be relying on the second-hand markets mostly for the turnover of the car fleet and the refreshment, and let's say they start to come and to be more available in 10 years' time, this will probably mean that with a purchase you would need to also replace the battery. I mean, in a way, I'm trying to think of what we'll be talking about as an important factor in Bulgaria so that there are more EVs available. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think, I mean, the issue of whether the battery is, I mean, the degradation of the battery will, of course, impact the price of the second-hand or third-hand electric vehicle as well. But I think, you know, that's why the corporate vehicle market is so important for stimulating the second-hand or third-hand vehicle market, because those cars stay in circulation in the corporate vehicle market much less, so like around 4 years or even less than that. So this is really the big potential that the corporate vehicle market has in stimulating the second and third-hand vehicle market.
Just a quick announcement that all the attendees have been upgraded to panelists. So people, attendees, hello. If you want to ask a question or comment, please raise your hand and we'll know that you want to contribute and to get into the conversation. I see that there is Alex Zvezdov and Galina Tsviatkova who are still staying there as attendees. Probably they have not accepted the invitation to be a panelist, but if you still want to take part in the conversation, you're welcome. I see that there is a comment by Radost in the chat, and it's in English. Alex, I think you can also read it yourself.
Yeah. I think it's more of a comment. But yeah, no, I would absolutely. So he says he says he needs to leave the webinar, but he said, sorry, no, it is a question. I would be happy to hear from Ms. Keynes about support that could be given for electric public transport options like trolley buses, trams, as well as ultra capacity e-buses. Battery is not the only option for e-vehicles. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think that things like low emission zones have to come hand in hand with support for public transport. So, you know, zero emission public transport options are the number one option that should be invested in, obviously. And, you know, the first option should always be to get increased use of public infrastructure. And of course, like trams and trolleyways are a much more efficient use of infrastructure and materials and resources than individual transport. So absolutely, there should be priority investment given to zero emission public transport. Yeah, so I would fully agree, basically. Yeah. But we need to remember, though, that why zero emission vehicles are so important is that there will always be the need, in particular in intercity and rural areas, that people will have to continue to rely on individual transport. So, and it's crucial that those cars, and of course cars in cities that remain as well, have to be zero emission as soon as possible.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks, Radost, for commenting and bringing up the point that e-batteries have also an alternative when we talk about public transport and mobility in the cities. Alex, you mentioned that public company-owned cars should be looked at and incentivized on, in terms of companies purchasing mostly electric vehicles. And I'm wondering if you as TNE or at Commission level, there is any thinking of addressing specifically logistics companies, especially in view of the growth of e-commerce and the generated extra logistics activity around this, and as a result from this. So is there any intention or idea to specifically work with logistics companies and in a way oblige them to concentrate their fleets on electric vehicles?
Yeah, so we collaborate with the electric vehicles, with the logistics companies, for example, on joint statements and common advocacy on things like CO2 targets for trucks and vans, which helps increase the supply of the vehicles that these companies can buy. Because of course, the problem that a lot of these companies have is lack of supply. But of course, the targets I mentioned earlier that we as TNE support, and we're working now, we have a dedicated program at Transport and Environment on electrifying fleets. So we are working to advocate to the European Commission to come with a legislative proposal that would mandate fleets above a certain size, so around, you know, above 15 vehicles or 20 vehicles. So most, you know, all logistics companies would fall under this, and that they would have to go zero emission entirely by 2050, 2030, sorry, a mistake, and would of course have to increase the share of their zero emission vehicles in a stepwise approach until then. So yeah, absolutely, this is something that we're going to be working on a lot over the next months and years.
I absolutely agree, and definitely something that we at Zazeneto would also like to pick up as a line of work on in our Clean Cities campaign. Is there anybody else here in the Zoom talk that has a comment or a question? Please raise your hand if you do. And there are also some questions which we had through the Facebook live stream and through YouTube. And if possible, I would ask the translator to translate them for Alex, because they're in Bulgarian. Will you be able to do this?
I will do that.
Okay, thank you.
So what kind of vehicle you would recommend for a person living in a middle scale city in Bulgaria is the first question coming from YouTube channel, and it's Georgi Georgiev's question.
To be honest, I don't drive a car, I have to admit. So I have a license, but I don't drive. As someone living in a city, also I feel like having a car is actually more of a burden than anything. So although I follow very closely the regulations around cars, I wouldn't feel I'm in the right position to recommend the type of car that he should be looking at, I'm afraid. So I have to pass on this. But I can ask my colleagues who know a bit more about that.
And I think it's not only about cars, it's in general what kind of vehicle. Maybe we can include here bikes or whatever.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, a bike would be, it depends on what the use would be, right? So, I mean, I cycle as much as I cycle most places. And I think, yeah, obviously bikes are a much more sustainable type of transport than a car, even if it is a zero emission car, given the material going into it, and also, of course, the life cycle emissions of a bicycle are incredibly low. So, no, absolutely, a bike, I would say, should be the first choice.
Okay, I think it also answers the next question. What about the bicycles? What's their role in this process? So you said it's maybe this should be the first choice if you want to add, or anybody else would like to add something.
And maybe just to add on what I said before, like we as Transport Environment do not work on bikes or cycling or public transport, even though we very much support those modes of transport, because there aren't any regulations at European Union level that actually, let's say, impact this. Yeah, that's why we don't as an organization work on these, but of course we very much support them.
Thank you, Alex. Just before we break, I would allow myself one last question, and it's on trucks. During the EU Mobility Days in Brno, we heard from several logistics companies that they're already looking into and even ordering trucks which are zero emissions. How do you, and I know that you work on transport on trucks in TNE since a long time, you've been following the topic. So where are they in terms of zero emissions, and what can we expect in terms of ground transportation and ground logistics, long distance ground logistics in Europe when trucks are engaged?
So zero emission trucks are coming as well, obviously a bit more slowly than cars. Most truck makers, so I think there's about 50 different battery electric trucks that are in series production for next year. So Scania and Daimler are both committed to going 100% zero emission by 2039 and 2040, I think. And so, you know, the technical potential is there. It's perfectly possible for all trucking to be zero emission. The best technology seems to be battery electric trucks, but fuel cell electric trucks also will probably play some role as well. And the important piece of legislation that will incentivize this is the truck CO2 standard. So the exact equivalent for cars but for trucks. And this is being revised right now, and there'll be a proposal coming in November. So there'll be lots of work that TNE will be doing on trying to incentivize similar supply side targets for electric trucks, and also to make sure that they also have a phase out date for ICE trucks.
Thanks a lot, Alex. I didn't know that it's a revision process is going on, so thanks a lot. Do we have any other questions from YouTube and from the Facebook Live, Ivo?
No, that's it. We have thanks from the people asking the questions.
Okay. Anybody else who is here? Final comments, final questions? Okay, I also don't have anything else to add. Just to say thank you very much, Alex, for joining us and for being able to dedicate time for preparation and definitely presenting also data for Bulgaria. And some of it I have not seen, to be honest, especially the chart with the taxation comparison. So this is something that I would definitely look into in more detail. We have identified the potential and definitely the disadvantage of the taxation policy that we have now, and it's something that we are planning to work on in the coming year, also within the Clean Cities campaign. So looking forward to the work we can do together as well. And we stay in touch definitely about the Air Quality Directive revision as well. As Clean Cities campaign, we'll be working on this closely together with you.
Definitely.
So not the last time we speak and cooperate. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thank you very much for having me.
Благодаря много на всички. Благодаря, че участвахте, че бяхте с нас и до следващия път.
Thank you everyone. Thank you for participating. See you next time. We're going to have a next webinar on the 6th of October. We are going to discuss the health effects on human health by the transport pollution. We're going to have 2 lecturers who made surveys about the urban environment and the southeastern region. So from 2 to 4, we're going to focus on the 6th, we're going to focus on the effects on human health. We're going to hear a lot of new interesting things. We're going to have a Facebook event posted tomorrow on the Facebook page of the Zemята. Thank you very much and have a great day all.